In this programme, I've come to a place of extremes. I'm sitting on the edge of the world's largest salt pan in the driest part of an arid continent. I'm in Australia, and I've come here to investigate a tragedy that will have repercussions for all of us who come here looking for adventure. Every year, thousands of cars like this one are rented out to people who want to come out and explore the Australian outback. If you break down on a highway like this, you're going to be spotted pretty quickly. But if you head off of the tarred roads, you're entering thousands of miles of desert, where it's a totally different story.
This is one of the world's great last frontiers. It has a lot of romanticism attached to it. I'm always amazed by the number of people who say, it was like a cathedral. It actually evokes feelings of great spirituality in people.
In this Olympic year, attention is going to be focused on Australia like never before. And that means more people coming to explore not just the cities, but the outback as well. 9 out of 10 Australians live within 100 miles of the coast. The rest of the continent is barren and virtually deserted. But it's more accessible to ordinary tourists than any other wilderness I've been to, and that creates problems of its own.
When I see the tourists coming through in their higher four-wheel drives, I just pray that they're going to be okay. Because I know that the majority of people are inexperienced. They don't have an understanding of how big a country like Australia is and how remote it is. Our patrol area is approximately 500,000 square kilometres. That's about the size of Great Britain twice. So if you're not prepared in this country, you're going to get yourself into some trouble.
It's remote. The temperature regularly tops 100 degrees, and the roads are often no more than tracks of mud or sand. But it's magnificent country, and four-wheel drive vehicles make this accessible to people straight from the plane. Of course, that's the irony, though. They can also get you into places where you can have a lot of trouble.
The bottom line is that when people bog a vehicle and they can't get it out of the bog, it's not a vehicle breakdown. It's a life-threatening situation.
The problem is so great that the police in Western Australia put all their outback officers through this bushcraft and survival course so that they can advise off-road travellers.
One of the old bush methods of working out direction was by what we call the shadow stick. If you draw a straight line between where the shadows have been, then that line is an east-west indicator.
It's something that we've had to do because of the sheer numbers of people that are travelling in the outback and their need to find more and more isolated regions, the need to find places where nobody has been.
Out here you can't just call up the breakdown services, so you have to do your own homework, and the first lesson is don't expect too much when you pick up your four-wheel drive. Now, the hire companies claim that they advise their customers on the dangers of travelling in the outback. They say they tell them to notify the police of where they're going and when they come back, to always stay with their vehicle in case of a breakdown, and about the importance of carrying water in a place as extremely hot as this. But in fact, we've hired our vehicles from 2 different hire companies and never received any of that advice. Outback policemen like Graham Smith despair of that situation, as hire car companies are often the only people who come face to face with overseas travellers. He'd like them to take more responsibility.
I would have thought that it would be mandatory for them to offer some sort of instruction on the capabilities of the vehicle and also the limitations of the vehicle. A minimum of, say, half an hour to an hour's training so that they're satisfied that these people are able to operate the vehicles effectively.
Well, we've taken a few sensible precautions to make sure that we travel safely. For a start, we have two vehicles because we've got a lot of kit and because it's safer. If one vehicle gets stuck, the other one can tow it out. If one breaks down, you still have transport. We've also added a lot of equipment which wasn't available from the hire company, which we've had to beg, steal or borrow. We've got a long-handled shovel like this, which is excellent because you can get right underneath the vehicle in soft conditions. We've got a second spare tyre. That's very important because punctures are common out here and carrying a second one's the easiest way to deal with them. We've also got a pump to reinflate our tyres if we have to lower the pressure to pull out in soft conditions. And just for a few dollars I've been able to add a can of tyre sealant. That's also a very handy way of sorting out a puncture in an emergency. We've also got lots of water. Now, the bare minimum is 5 litres per person per day, but in deserts I like to work on the basis of trying to provide 20 to 25 litres per person. We've got coolant for the engine, very important, oil for the engine, very important, and we've got spare fuel. This is the type of jack most hire cars come with. It's a bottle jack, and they're fine on roads. But when you're in soft conditions, they can be very difficult to get underneath because you have to dig them in. So we've added to that this jack here, working on the principle of two. Two of every piece of equipment that's vitally important. Added to all that is a tow rope. You can't assume that someone who might happen along will have one. And being towed out is the easiest way of becoming unbogged. Well, with all this equipment, we're pretty much well set up and can go most anywhere. But if you're put off by the thought of all this gear, perhaps you shouldn't be going into the Outback, because it's one place not to be taken lightly.
That's been ingrained in people who've been born and bred in this country. They know to treat the Outback with respect. This is Perth in Western Australia. One Friday morning, Russell Lagden left his home near the city with his wife Carol and his 5-year-old son Ben for a long weekend driving to the old mining town of Coolgardie. It's about 300 miles away as the crow flies, but they told colleagues and friends they wanted to use back roads instead.
The plan was to go to a little used track where the old miners used to push their wheelbarrows to the gold mines. And it's been reopened over the last probably 10 years or so. And we thought we'd go up there camping.
The Lagdens had delayed their trip by 2 weeks because a cyclone had washed out the track and they wanted to give it time to dry out.
There's some soft ground.
Some soft ground, is it?
Even so, they often had to stop while Russell tested submerged sections with a spade to see if they could get through. Their four-wheel drive coped with everything until one of the most remote parts of the track, 125 kilometres from the nearest settlement.
One small thing can really change your whole life. You know, 1 minute you think you're driving through a long puddle and then you're stuck miles from anywhere.
The Lagdens tried to lever the vehicle up and put branches under the wheels to increase the traction. But by the end of the first day, they'd only managed to come this far, about 20 yards. With at least the same amount of distance ahead of them, they resigned themselves to another night in the bush.
It was just probably the most desperate situation I've been in. I think to say scary is trivialising it. There really is no word that can describe the emotion that you feel when you are so isolated.
They did everything they could to make themselves conspicuous from the air. They put up the bonnet of their car and drew an SOS sign in the road. They prepared a signal fire and tested different leaves to see which would create the best signal.
Look at that smoke.
Russell had told colleagues he'd be back at work on the Tuesday morning. When he didn't turn up, his secretary tried to call him without luck.
That evening, the Lagdens missed a dinner appointment with Russell's parents. And when he wasn't at work again the next day, his father raised the alarm.
But the Lagden situation was deteriorating, and they'd ruled out trying to free the car themselves.
We were so exhausted we couldn't do any more because we cut back on our food supply so that we had plenty of food for Ben, so we were virtually eating nothing.
That's when you think about walking out for help because you're absolutely desperate to do something to improve your lot.
We talked about it, but it had always been ingrained in us right from when I started driving with my father that you always stay with the car.
And I think it's probably harder to take that decision to stay there and do nothing than it is to actually physically go and start walking.
4 days and nights passed. The Lagdens knew someone would raise the alarm, but they had no idea how soon a search might start or how successful it would be. On the 5th day, Russell switched on the midday news to see if their disappearance had been reported.
Police believe the family may have become bogged on a dirt road between Hyden and Coolgardie.
That was the midday report, and it was just about an hour and a quarter later that we heard a plane overhead.
Their smoke signal attracted it straight to them.
I had contained myself the whole time I was there, but it was just such a wonderful feeling to know that we were now safe. I just cried my eyes out.
After 45 minutes, the plane had led a police car to the spot and they were winching the car free after spending nearly 5 days bogged in.
Advising people as to where you're going really is vital. We had been very specific in speaking with our friends and workmates and families, saying exactly where we were going, and that was really our saving grace.
But if you're faced with a real crisis, there is a device that you can buy or sometimes even hire that can save your life. It's this, an EPIRB. That's an emergency position indicating radio beacon. If you trigger this device, it sends a signal via satellite to the emergency services, which actually locates your position.
You can rent EPIRBs for a few dollars a day, but if you don't have one, you rely on being spotted, most probably from a plane. Out here, it's the easiest way to cover the huge distances involved. But remember, you should never leave your vehicle, and here's why. You can hardly see me, but the car I'm leaning on stands out clearly. As for signalling, smoke can be seen for miles.
If you need to, you can make fire using your car battery. First of all, you connect your jump leads up to the terminals, and then you're going to need some tinder. I'm going to use this, which is a field dressing from the first aid kit. There it goes. Simple as that.
If your car battery is dead, think smaller. First, the basics, a torch and a toilet roll.
And this is the magic ingredient, wire wool.
When you short out the terminals, the wire fibres get so hot that you can use them to set fire to the paper.
There you go. That could really get you out of trouble.
And this is the party trick of survival. Glycol is the main component in antifreeze. Pour a spoonful into your tinder, then potassium permanganate. Some people carry this to sterilise infections. Mix the two together, and hey presto.
You get the idea.
I'm heading now for the quintessential Outback town. It's only 250 miles from the south coast, but it could be on a different planet. Water is so scarce that the first people to live there were limited to just 2 gallons a week. Not a lot when the temperature pushes 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The situation is better today, but even so, water is at a premium. This is the only coin-operated water dispenser I've ever seen, and it's where travellers passing through on their way to the Outback can fill their jerry cans at about 10 pence per container.
So no one would live here without a very good reason, and that reason is these, opals. This is Coober Pedy. It's the opal mining capital of the world.
It's so hot that the miners who live here year-round live underground, where the temperatures are cooler. In fact, the name Coober Pedy means white man's burrow in the local Aboriginal language, and you can still see caves that house whole families. The reason I've come to Coober Pedy is that it's home to the policeman who investigated the incident which brought me to the Outback. It involved Austrian tourists Karl Gotschke and Caroline Grossmuller.
Karl and Caroline arrived in Sydney, where they collected a Brits hire car and proceeded then to travel through the Northern Territory and the east coast of Australia, and eventually made their way down to South Australia.
The Australian summer was just starting as they headed into the Outback. Here that's low season because the weather's too hot for most tourists. We set off to pick up the route from which only one of them would return alive.
The first thing you see when you come off the tarmac is this warning sign that backs up everything I've been saying. Most importantly, it says that in the event of a breakdown, never leave your vehicle. It couldn't be clearer.
As we head into the desert, it's comforting to know that we've got two well-kitted out cars, as well as HF radio and EPIRB. Between us, we've also got more than 20 years off-road driving experience. When disaster struck, Karl and Caroline had none of that. But following their route, it's easy to see what attracted them here in the first place.
Like they did, I'm driving on the Udinadatta track, which is about 2 hours outside of Kuba PD.
It dates back over 100 years, to the days when camel convoys were the only transport out here.
Today, the Udinadatta track has a surface good enough to be driven on in an ordinary car. But of course, it's the little trails that go off into the desert that attract the off-road drivers.
And one of those leads 60 kilometres to Lake Eyre. It's so barren and remote that Karl and Caroline were apprehensive about driving it. They wanted to know if they'd be safe should anything happen to their car, so they called in to the nearest settlement for advice.
This is William Creek. It's the gateway to Lake Eyre, and it's got a permanent population of just 15, but about 80,000 people pass through here each year. Now that may seem a lot, but actually it's not. I've travelled over 100 miles from the tarmac to get here, and in that time I haven't passed a single car. But one thing everybody does when they come here is pop into the bar for a cool drink.
Once that allowed the roadhouse manager to take down details and keep track of people travelling in the area. But registration systems like these are open to abuse and not endorsed by the police.
It's often the case that Outback pubs do offer services to travellers, but it's an ad hoc system that has got no legal basis, and there's no guarantee that someone will come looking for you, although those guarantees are given.
But Karl and Caroline did leave their details at the pub, leading to a misunderstanding that was to have fatal consequences.
They spoke there to the son of the manager. The manager was away at the time. Now, he filled out what's called a search and rescue book there, and it's pretty obvious that they were given an assurance that should they not return at the allotted time, someone would come looking for them.
After a night under the stars at William Creek, we loaded our cars and we too set off for Lake Eyre.
As they headed onto the lake track, Karl and Caroline would have seen this sign, and it advises them to check in at the William Creek Hotel before heading down the track. Well, having left their details there, they felt certain that if they got into any trouble, someone was going to come and look for them.
However, when they went into the hotel to register, the manager's son had been unable to find the existing SAR book. So he commenced a new one, but didn't tell anyone. So when the manager came back from Melbourne, he checked the old SAR book, and every indication was that there was no one at Lake Eyre.
We're now in four-wheel drive country. This track would kill the suspension on anything else, and we have to avoid parts of it after a rare downpour. Life out here revolves around the search for water. The sound of finches is always a sure indicator. These ones are drinking at a borehole sunk for stock on the world's largest cattle ranch. Occasionally you can see the course water takes when there is any rain, but it's the start of the summer and there won't be any for months.
It's taken a couple of hours to get here from William Creek, and as you can see, Lake Eyre is anything but filled with water.
A fifth of the whole country drains into the lake, but it's so dry here that it's only ever filled 4 times since records began.
At 15 metres below sea level, this is the lowest point on the whole continent, and it's also the driest. What moisture there is here simply evaporates, leaving the world's largest salt pan.
As Carl and Caroline reached the lake, there was still no hint of trouble to come.
They decided to camp next to this rain tank, which at the time contained about 300 litres of water. Now, because it was windy, Carl drove the truck in here to act as a windbreak, and that's when their troubles really began.
Getting stuck seemed like little more than an inconvenience, and Carl thought he knew how to deal with it.
The first thing he did was look at the tyres. He decided to let some air out of them to reduce their pressure. That's a pretty good thing to do, because if you lower the tyre pressure, you increase its footprint and it gives you more traction. But crucially, he didn't let anywhere near enough out.
So he decided to dig the sand out from around the wheel, but with no shovel in the car, he had to improvise with a plate, and that didn't work either.
As always in survival, the key thing is not to panic, but to think clearly. They weren't in a life or death situation yet. The vehicle was full of food, they had a 65-litre tank of water on board, and this rain tank held 300 litres. They could have stayed here quite safely for weeks.
So they settled in, thinking they'd been missed when they didn't return to William Creek. But remember, because of the mix-up over the search and rescue books, the pub manager didn't even know they were at the lake. On top of that, they'd been told that in the height of the summer, there might be no other traffic for 6 weeks. So when no one arrived the next day or the day after, they must have started to worry.
On the third day, the temperature soared to 41 degrees in the shade. In the open, you can add another 15 degrees to that. The idea of cool evenings out here is pretty relative. But at 4 p.m, they decided to start walking out.
Leaving the car was their first serious mistake. And on top of that, they'd made a crucial miscalculation, as the police discovered once they'd translated their log from German into English.
They basically worked out that they had approximately 62 kilometres to travel, and for every 10 kilometres they would consume 1 litre of water each.
But they'd based their calculations on walking in Austria. In the heat of an Australian summer, they would have needed far more water than they could possibly have carried. Nightfall, but in an Australian summer, not even the dark brings relief from the heat. Carl and Caroline walked on in temperatures that were sapping their strength. After just 5 hours, they had to stop and rest. They'd already used 1/3 of their water.
To give you some idea of how hot it was, Caroline's shoes had actually begun to melt. Well, they rested for 5 hours before deciding to press on. But they'd only gone for another hour before they had to stop, as Carl couldn't go any further.
At this point, they decided to split up. As the fitter walker, Caroline was still convinced she could make it to William Creek. She took Carl's boots and 9 litres of water and headed into the night. The two would never see each other again. Carl spent the next day in the tent, and at 9 o'clock that night headed back to the camper van, arriving there at 2 in the morning. Then he waited and waited, not knowing whether Caroline would ever reach safety. The police were alerted on the 15th of December. A German couple driving to the lake had found Caroline's body 6 days after she had started walking.
We estimated that she'd been dead for approximately 5 days. And it appeared the amount of water she was intaking was nowhere near sufficient. She would have become delirious and basically fallen down, and that would have been the end.
This is the spot where Caroline's body was eventually found. It's as desolate a place as you can imagine. To get here, she'd walked over 30 kilometres from the lake, but this is only halfway to William Creek. Today, there's just this simple cross that's a memorial to Caroline, but perhaps also it serves as a warning to those who come here unprepared.
As the police searched further down the track, they found notes that Caroline had stuck to the signs pleading for help. Carl was found alive in the van, and the police investigation began. At first it focused on the pub at William Creek, where the manager's son had forgotten to tell anyone that he had started a new search and rescue book. But blaming that misunderstanding would be too easy. As far as the police are concerned, there's always a better alternative to relying on strangers, however well-meaning they appear to be.
Our advice to anyone travelling in remote areas is to nominate a friend or relative that they can trust that will advise the police if they're not back at a certain time. And I think Carl and Caroline should have done that.
Then there was the lack of equipment and preparation. Some people would like to see the hire companies take responsibility for this.
If Carl and Caroline had had even a small amount of training, they need never have found themselves in this situation. Quite rightly, Carl deflated his tyres, but not nearly enough. It took one policeman just 10 minutes to unbog the vehicle because he knew how much to let out.
As for leaving the vehicle, you could argue forever about that. They left because they had been told the track might not be used for 6 weeks, but the tourists who found Caroline's body would have found them in 6 days. All I can say is that in most cases, your chances of survival are far higher if you stay put, and this case proves that golden rule.
If one death stands out as being totally unnecessary, it's the death of Caroline Grosmuller. And I believe this will be a catalyst to get things changed. I'm hoping as a result of this, those persons concerned, i.e. the hire car companies, travel agencies and the police, get their heads together and come up with some sort of policy. Because if they don't, I don't think that this will be the last death in these circumstances.
But I hope that any changes bear one thing in mind. Wild places like this have always attracted people because they provide an escape from all the usual rules and regulations.
We need to be very, very careful that we don't stifle people's opportunity to experience the Outback. People have to be allowed to have this experience, but in absolute safety. And I think it can be done.
But nothing's going to happen overnight, so if you are planning an Outback adventure, put your own safety first and don't rely on anyone else to do it for you.
I think at the end of the day, if you're going to head out into any wild place, you have to remember that you have a duty of care for your own well-being. That means making sure you have the right equipment, knowledge and training, and following the local advice. If you do all of those things, there's absolutely no reason why you shouldn't have the adventure of a lifetime.
Next week, surviving with the Royal Air Force.
In this program, I've come to a place of extremes. I'm sitting on the edge of the world's largest salt pan in the driest part of an arid continent. I'm in Australia, and I've come here to investigate a tragedy that will have repercussions for all of us who come here looking for adventure. Every year, thousands of cars like this one are rented out to people who want to come out and explore the Australian outback. If you break down on a highway like this, you're going to be spotted pretty quickly. But if you head off of the tarred roads, you're entering thousands of miles of desert, where it's a totally different story.
This is one of the world's great last frontiers. It has a lot of romanticism attached to it. I'm always amazed by the number of people who say, it was like a cathedral. It actually evokes feelings of great spirituality in people.
In this Olympic year, attention is going to be focused on Australia like never before. And that means more people coming to explore not just the cities, but the outback as well. 9 out of 10 Australians live within 100 miles of the coast. The rest of the continent is barren and virtually deserted. But it's more accessible to ordinary tourists than any other wilderness I've been to, and that creates problems of its own.
When I see the tourists coming through in their higher four-wheel drives, I just pray that they're going to be okay. Because I know that the majority of people are inexperienced. They don't have an understanding of how big a country like Australia is and how remote it is. Our patrol area is approximately 500,000 square kilometres. That's about the size of Great Britain twice. So if you're not prepared in this country, you're going to get yourself into some trouble.
It's remote. The temperature